In the quiet, manicured lanes of Willow Creek Estates, nothing ever seemed out of place. The lawns were uniformly trimmed, the hedges measured to the inch, and even the mailboxes gleamed under the HOA's ever-watchful eye. Every sunrise brought a parade of sprinklers, and every sunset echoed with the soft hum of luxury SUVs gliding into garages. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved, but no one really smiled. Ethan Cross had lived there for nearly 6 years. Though a web designer who worked from home, he valued the peace and order of the place, until that order turned on him. His modest grey townhouse stood near the cul-de-sac, its small driveway just large enough for his car and a visitor's. It wasn't much, but it was his space, his own small slice of suburban quiet. Across from him, however, lived Margaret Hollingsworth, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, though no official title had ever been given. Everyone called her Karen behind closed doors, though never to her face. Margaret had a voice like a foghorn, and a presence that could fill an entire block. Her husband was rarely seen, but her Range Rover was ever present, usually parked in places it shouldn't be. The trouble began on a sunny Saturday morning in early spring. Ethan had just finished washing his car, taking pride in the glistening shine of the hood, when he noticed Margaret's Range Rover idling at the end of his driveway. He thought little of it, until the following day when it appeared again. This time it wasn't idling, it was parked, right in the spot where Ethan's visitor was supposed to park. He assumed it was an accident at first, a simple misunderstanding. But when it happened again and again, it became clear this wasn't coincidence. Margaret had decided that Ethan's extra parking space was hers now. Over the next week, her Range Rover occupied that spot more frequently than her own driveway. Sometimes she left it there overnight, sometimes for days. It didn't seem to matter that Ethan had politely asked her to move it, or that it wasn't her property. In her mind, that extra patch of pavement was wasted space. She, after all, was the president of the Neighborhood Beautification Committee, as she often reminded everyone. But to Ethan, it was personal. That spot represented his autonomy, the one small area outside of HOA control. And seeing it taken by someone who already had everything lit, a quiet anger deep within him. When he brought it up at the next HOA meeting, Margaret smiled sweetly and claimed she thought the space was community property. She even suggested that Ethan, being a single man without much use for it, might not mind if she parked there occasionally. The other members, intimidated by her reputation, stayed silent. The matter was dismissed without resolution. After that, the Range Rover's appearances became a daily occurrence. It wasn't just a car anymore, it was a statement. Margaret was asserting dominance, and Ethan was being pushed into a corner. Soon she began leaving notes on his car, petty complaints about his recycling bin placement, his porch lights, even the shade of grey paint on his door. Her campaign of irritation escalated, each note more condescending than the last. The HOA, under her influence, began sending friendly reminders about minor violations Ethan supposedly committed. He was being targeted, slowly, deliberately, and with that same smug smile she wore every time she waved from her driveway. Ethan's patience wore thin. The quiet mornings he once loved were now filled with tension. He couldn't even look out his window without seeing that gleaming white Range Rover sitting where it didn't belong, like a trophy she'd claimed from him. Then came the final straw. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived with a new desk Ethan had ordered. The driver needed to pull up close to unload it, but Margaret's car was in the way. When the driver knocked on her door, she refused to move it, insisting she was busy. The desk was left on the sidewalk, and by the time Ethan carried it in, a light drizzle had already ruined the top surface. That night, Ethan sat in his living room, staring at the damaged desk, and made a quiet decision. If Margaret wanted a war over a parking spot, she was going to get one. But not the kind of war she expected. He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't argue. He wouldn't even confront her directly. No, Ethan decided to take a different approach, one that would strike at the very heart of what Margaret valued most: control. Over the next few days, he began sketching ideas on his computer, diagrams, measurements, landscaping layouts. It started small and just idle brainstorming, but soon became something much bigger. A plan to transform the space she had claimed, to make it something untouchable, something that would expose the hypocrisy of the HOA and Margaret's self-importance. When he was done, Ethan smiled. It wasn't revenge exactly, at least not in the traditional sense. It was poetic justice. All he needed was a few materials, a permit or two and a little patience, and soon, the spot Margaret had fought so hard to claim would become the one thing she could never touch again. Because by the time he was finished, it wouldn't be a parking space anymore. It would be a private park. Ethan spent the next morning hunched over his desk, the ruined one that Margaret's arrogance had indirectly destroyed, sketching the first outlines of his plan. The idea was simple. Turn the parking space she kept stealing into something permanent, beautiful and absolutely off-limits to anyone but himself. But beneath that simplicity was strategy, precision and quiet defiance. He started by researching local zoning and HOA regulations, the same rules Margaret loved to weaponize against everyone else. Buried in the dense web of clauses and fine print, Ethan found a particular section that made him pause. It stated that homeowners could landscape and beautify non-structural outdoor areas under personal maintenance responsibility, provided they adhered to aesthetic standards and filed a minor improvement notice. That was it. His golden ticket. If he followed the rules and every single one of them, the HOA couldn't legally stop him. In fact, they'd be forced to approve it. And Margaret, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood's perfection, would have to watch it happen right across the street from her own window. Ethan spent days refining his blueprint. The space would no longer resemble a parking area at all. Instead, it would become a miniature garden park, complete with raised flower beds, decorative stones, a small water feature, and a bench engraved with his last name, Cross Garden. It wasn't just a statement. It was ownership in the purest form. Each evening, after Margaret's Range Rover disappeared into her driveway, Ethan would step outside, tape measure in hand, quietly mapping dimensions by the glow of his porch light. He knew she was watching. The flutter of curtains across the street betrayed her curiosity. That was fine. Let her wonder. The next week, he submitted his official improvement request to the HOA. His packet included every detail: design renderings, cost breakdowns, even plant species chosen for environmental harmony. It was so thorough, so precise, that rejecting it would expose blatant bias. And Ethan knew Margaret couldn't risk that, not publicly. When the HOA board gathered for their monthly review, the room was tense. Ethan attended, sitting quietly in the corner as the members shuffled papers. Margaret, seated at the head, wore her signature pastel cardigan and that carefully curated smile that hid her irritation. She scanned his submission, flipping through each page with deliberate slowness, as though looking for a flaw. But there wasn't one. After a long silence, she sighed. "Looks acceptable," she said finally. Though her tone cracked around the edges, the board voted. The motion passed. Ethan's plan was officially approved. The very next morning, he began the transformation. Contractors arrived early, unloading soil, stones, and wood planks. The once flat rectangle of asphalt was soon torn up, its black surface broken and hauled away. In its place, fresh earth was laid down, soft and rich. A small wooden fence, decorative, not obstructive, framed the perimeter. By afternoon, the skeletal outline of the private park was visible from every house on the street. Neighbors stopped to watch. Some smiled approvingly, others whispered, and across the road Margaret stood frozen on her porch, coffee cup trembling in her hand. Her parking spot, her unofficial second driveway, was gone. As days passed, Ethan's project drew more attention. He added flower beds with lavender and hydrangeas, solar-powered lanterns that glowed gently at dusk, and a bird bath carved from natural stone. He even planted a small Japanese maple at the center, its leaves turning red as if mirroring his quiet defiance. But what really made the difference was the sign. Mounted on a wooden post near the front, it read simply, "Private property, Cross Garden." No parking, no aggression, no shouting, just quiet, undeniable authority. Margaret's reaction was immediate. She stormed to the next HOA meeting, waving photos and complaining about unauthorized construction and detrimental neighborhood aesthetics. But the board reminded her she had approved the project herself. Her own signature was on the form. The humiliation was palpable. For years she had used the HOA as her personal army, bending rules to her will. But this time the very system she weaponized had turned against her. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The growing whispers around the neighborhood did it for him. Every passing day, as residents strolled by his new park, they complimented his creativity. Kids stopped to admire the flowers. Couples took photos near the maple tree. The HOA newsletter even featured it as an excellent example of community pride. That issue had Margaret's name printed right under the headline. It was the perfect, unintentional irony. But Ethan knew this victory wouldn't be the end. Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Her silence, though satisfying, was temporary. He could feel the storm gathering again. Late one evening, as he watered the flowers under a hazy sunset, he noticed her blinds twitch. She was still watching, still seething. And that's when he realized something else. Margaret's war wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Because while Ethan had won the battle of the parking spot, Margaret was already plotting her next move, one that would strike back harder, and this time she'd aim to destroy more than just a patch of pavement. Ethan smiled faintly as he turned off the hose. He was ready for whatever came next. For a few weeks, peace returned to Willow Creek Estates, or at least a fragile version of it. The little patch of green that once was Ethan's parking spot now thrived, bright with color and life. Birds gathered each morning at the bird bath. Neighbors smiled as they passed. Even the HOA's monthly bulletin praised the excellent example of eco-friendly transformation, but not everyone was smiling. Across the street, Margaret Hollingsworth, the self-anointed guardian of HOA perfection, watched her empire crack. She had spent years shaping the neighborhood's image, dictating what colors were acceptable for door trims, which flowers were aesthetic, and even how often residents should power wash their driveways. To her, control was everything, and Ethan's park, in her mind, was defiance carved into the earth. Every morning, she would step outside with her coffee, pretending to admire her own garden, but her gaze always lingered on cross garden. She watched the neighbors taking photos, children running around the edge, couples sitting on the bench in the evenings. Every compliment Ethan received felt like a needle under her skin. Soon, irritation turned into obsession. Her first move was subtle. One morning, Ethan found a small HOA notice taped to the edge of his fence, a reminder that all outdoor additions must be kept consistent with community standards. It wasn't a violation, just a warning. He ignored it. A week later, a second notice arrived, this time about the height of the perimeter fencing being slightly above acceptable measurement. The difference was less than half an inch. Again he complied, trimming the top rail and submitting proof to the HOA. Then came the noise complaint. Margaret claimed that Ethan's water feature created disruptive bubbling sounds. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Her own pool pump hummed louder than a generator. But Margaret wasn't trying to win fairly. She was trying to wear him down piece by piece, using the same bureaucracy he had once used against her. When those tactics failed to rattle him, she escalated. Late one evening, Ethan stepped outside to find his solar lantern smashed, shards scattered across the mulch. His signpost had been pulled halfway from the ground. The next morning, Margaret stood on her porch, sipping coffee, feigning surprise as if she had just noticed. He didn't accuse her, there was no proof, but the smug satisfaction in her posture said everything. He repaired the damage quietly, even adding a few new features, sturdier lanterns, a small security camera hidden within the maple's branches. A few nights later, the footage confirmed what he already knew. Around midnight, Margaret had walked across the street, flashlight in hand, poking around the edge of his garden. She didn't destroy anything that time. She was scouting, looking for leverage. Ethan backed up the footage, time-stamped it, and saved multiple copies. He didn't report it immediately, not yet. He wanted to wait, let her dig her own grave deeper. Within a week, her campaign intensified. The HOA began sending multiple letters a day, each citing new, increasingly absurd concerns. The bird bath was too reflective, the flowers too bright, even the maple tree was potentially invasive. Ethan responded to each with calm professionalism, attaching photos, referencing policy codes, and copying the entire board on every email. He knew Margaret's grip on the HOA was slipping. Several neighbors had grown tired of her antics and quietly supported him behind the scenes. Then, One morning, an envelope arrived marked Urgent Final Notice. The HOA, under Margaret's directive, demanded he remove the park entirely for non-compliance with community harmony standards. They gave him 7 days to comply or face fines. It was her final attempt to reassert dominance. A desperate, last-ditch power grab. Ethan didn't panic. Instead, he smiled, because he had been preparing for this moment all along. Within hours, he drafted a formal response, not just to the HOA, but to every homeowner in Willow Creek. It was a detailed, point-by-point rebuttal backed with policy citations, permits, photographic evidence, and, most importantly, proof that his project had been officially approved, with Margaret's signature on the form. He attached the security footage, too, a clip showing Margaret trespassing late at night, flashlight in hand. He didn't add commentary. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation could. He printed copies and hand-delivered them to every mailbox on the street. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Conversations that once happened in hushed tones now spilled into open whispers. Some residents laughed at the footage. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Margaret's carefully curated image as the perfect neighbor shattered overnight. At the following HOA meeting, the attendance was higher than ever. Dozens of homeowners showed up, some holding Ethan's printed letter. The room buzzed with quiet outrage. When Margaret arrived, her usual confidence faltered. She tried to call the meeting to order, but the murmurs wouldn't stop. Ethan sat silently in the back, calm as ever. One of the newer board members finally stood up and called for a vote. A motion to remove Margaret as president due to abuse of authority and misconduct. Hands went up across the room, one after another. The motion passed. Margaret's face drained of color. For years she had ruled with fear and manipulation. Now she sat in silence, the weight of humiliation pressing down harder than she could bear. She left the meeting without a word. Afterward, several neighbors approached Ethan to thank him, not just for standing up to her, but for restoring some sanity to the community. That night, as he sat on the bench in Cross Garden, the soft glow of lanterns flickering around him, Ethan felt something he hadn't in months: peace. Not victory, not gloating satisfaction, just peace. But deep down he knew Margaret wasn't finished. People like her didn't simply accept defeat. They plotted. They waited. And as he looked across the street at her darkened windows, a single thought crossed his mind. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. For several weeks, Willow Creek Estates existed in an unusual calm. Margaret's removal as HOA president felt like a collective exhale. The air was lighter, the neighborhood friendlier. Ethan's small park had become a quiet centerpiece, a symbol of defiance wrapped in greenery. Children played near the bench after school. Older residents paused there during evening walks, and everyone agreed that the neighborhood felt different now, freer. But behind the lace curtains of the Hollingsworth home, resentment was festering. Margaret had vanished from community life, but she had not disappeared entirely. She rarely left her house during the day, yet neighbors noticed her car moving at odd hours, headlights flashing across the cul-de-sac well past midnight. Packages arrived frequently, boxes, envelopes, rolls of printed papers. Her blinds were always drawn, though the faint glow of a laptop screen often shone through. Something was brewing. Something deliberate. Ethan sensed it too. Even without seeing her, he could feel her presence like a weight in the air. Her absence from HOA meetings wasn't defeat. It was plotting silence. And Margaret was never one to surrender quietly. One morning, a new notice appeared on his front door. It wasn't from the HOA, but from the City Code Enforcement Department. According to the letter, a complaint had been filed against his unauthorized structural installation, alleging that his park violated local land use ordinances. It wasn't an HOA issue this time. It was municipal. That was Margaret's first counterstrike. She had gone above the HOA, using official city channels to reopen the battle. Most people would have panicked, but Ethan stayed calm. He knew his paperwork was airtight. The park was classified as landscaping, not a structure, and every measurement fell within legal limits. Still, the complaint forced an inspection. 2 city officials arrived that week. Margaret happened to be trimming her hedges as they walked the property line, pretending to mind her own business. She wore that same pastel sweater and smug half-smile, clearly expecting to witness his embarrassment. But the officials left 20 minutes later, satisfied. The case was dismissed on the spot. Everything was compliant. Ethan didn't say a word. He simply nodded to her as she stood frozen by her hedge, pruning shears idle in her hand. The quiet victory hurt her more than any confrontation ever could, but she wasn't done. A few nights later, Ethan was woken by the soft crunch of gravel. He glanced through his blinds and saw movement, a faint figure crouching near the fence of Cross Garden. The security camera caught it clearly this time. Margaret again, pouring something along the edge of the flower beds before darting back across the street. By morning, the damage was obvious. The lavender plants had wilted overnight, their leaves curling unnaturally. The soil reeked of chemicals. She had poisoned them. Ethan could have called the police right then. The footage was undeniable, but instead he waited. He cleaned the beds, replaced the soil, replanted the flowers, and quietly installed 2 new hidden cameras. He wanted her to try again, because this time he wouldn't just catch her, he'd expose her. Within a week she returned, wearing a hoodie this time, carrying another bottle. The footage captured everything. Her face, her actions, even the label on the herbicide she was using. Ethan downloaded the footage, time-stamped it, and sent a copy, not to the police, not yet, but to the entire HOA mailing list. By morning, the neighborhood was in uproar. Everyone saw it. Margaret trespassing, vandalizing property, caught in the act. The HOA board issued a statement condemning her actions. Neighbors whispered on driveways, shaking their heads as they passed her house. For someone who once prided herself on neighborhood image, her reputation was now radioactive. Still, Ethan didn't gloat. He tended his garden, replacing the flowers she destroyed, maintaining the same calm she hated so much. But Margaret's pride couldn't handle the shame. The whispers became unbearable. The stares from passing cars, the pitying smiles, and they chipped away at her. She began snapping at delivery drivers, yelling at kids for riding bikes too close to her curb. The same woman who once ruled with fear now looked small, cornered, unraveling. Then, she made her most desperate move yet. Late one Saturday night, Ethan's phone buzzed with a notification. His security feed had gone offline. He rushed outside and froze. The park was a mess. The fence was smashed, the bench overturned, the bird bath shattered. Soil was scattered across the pavement. The maple tree snapped clean at its base. And in the faint glow of his porch light, something gleamed, the license plate of a white Range Rover speeding away. For a long time, Ethan stood there in silence. His masterpiece, his quiet rebellion, lay in ruins. But underneath the shock, something colder stirred. Resolve. By sunrise, he had already filed a police report, submitted the footage, and spoken to his insurance company. Neighbors rallied around him, some even volunteering to help clean the debris. Margaret's car was impounded within hours, the evidence undeniable. The news spread fast. Destruction of property, criminal charges pending. Her influence, her image, her control, all gone. That evening, Ethan sat among the wreckage, the air still heavy with the scent of broken soil and dust. But instead of anger, he felt clarity. Margaret had destroyed the garden out of spite, but in doing so, she had destroyed herself completely, and he already knew how he would rebuild, not just restore what was lost, but expand it, bigger, brighter, permanent. If she had thought Cross Garden was an act of defiance before, she had no idea what was coming next, because Ethan's next creation wouldn't just be a garden, it would be a monument to patience, persistence, and poetic justice. And this time, no one, not even Margaret, would ever be able to tear it down again. The morning after the destruction, the cul-de-sac of Willow Creek Estates was unusually quiet. Not the usual quiet of early mornings. This was the kind of silence that follows shock, the kind that lingers after something sacred has been violated. The shattered remains of Cross Garden were still visible across Ethan's driveway, broken wood, splintered fence posts, crushed petals scattered like confetti across the pavement. Ethan stood on his porch, coffee in hand, staring at the mess. It was strange. After months of escalating tension, after everything Margaret had done, he didn't feel anger anymore. Only clarity, because this wasn't just vandalism. It was confession. Margaret had finally revealed herself for what she truly was, not a defender of order, Not a protector of community standards, but a bitter, unraveling bully who couldn't stand to see someone else win by following the rules. Her need for control had consumed her, and now she'd destroyed her own reputation trying to destroy him. But what she didn't realize was that destruction can be an opportunity, a blank canvas waiting for rebirth. As the morning sun climbed higher, neighbors began to emerge from their homes. They approached cautiously, offering quiet sympathy and outrage. Some shook their heads. Others offered to help clean. Old Mr. Reynolds from 2 houses down even brought over his wheelbarrow, muttering something about community spirit finally meaning something again. Ethan thanked them all. But he wasn't interested in just cleaning up. He wanted to build again, bigger, bolder, and this time unbreakable. That afternoon he pulled out his blueprints once more. The original cross garden had been peaceful and understated. The new one would be a masterpiece, a living statement that no one, not even the most self-entitled neighbor, could silence. He began designing a new layout, a wider footprint that extended all the way to the property line, bordered by reinforced wooden posts and wrought iron fencing. Inside, he envisioned multiple levels of flower beds cascading downward like natural steps. The maple tree would return, this time planted deeper, its roots secured in fresh soil. At the center, he would add something new, a circular stone platform engraved with a quote that had guided him throughout this feud. "The greatest revenge is to live beautifully." It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about rising above. Word spread quickly about his plans. Neighbors who had once stayed neutral now volunteered to help. The incident had united them. Years of Margaret's tyranny had built resentment that finally found a shared purpose. One by one they came forward. Susan from the corner house donated flower seeds. Greg, a contractor, offered to rebuild the fence for free. Even the teenagers from the next block showed up with shovels and paint. The rebuilding began that very weekend. The sound of hammering echoed across the cul-de-sac, not chaos, but rhythm, the sound of defiance turning into creation. Soil was overturned, wood cut, stone laid. People worked together, laughing, talking, rediscovering what it meant to be neighbors rather than subjects under one person's rule. And all the while, Margaret's curtains remained tightly closed. She never stepped outside, but the faint flicker of movement behind the glass revealed she was watching as the very people she once commanded now ignored her entirely, pouring their energy into rebuilding the thing she had tried to destroy. Ethan didn't look her way. Not once. By the second week, Cross Garden 2.0 began to take shape. The iron fencing gleamed under the sunlight. Fresh lavender and hydrangeas returned, planted in wider beds. The new bird bath, a gift from the Reynolds family, sat under a shaded archway of climbing ivy. Solar lanterns lined the path, brighter and sturdier than before. At the center, the engraved stone arrived. It was heavier than Ethan expected, carved from marble, polished to a shine. The quote was etched deeply across its face. When it was placed in position, everyone paused, a moment of silent satisfaction, as if the words themselves anchored the garden in something stronger than soil. When it was done, the transformation was breathtaking. What had once been a small personal statement was now a community landmark. Residents took evening walks just to pass by it. Photos of Cross Garden began circulating online, shared on local pages as a story of neighborhood resilience. The irony was poetic. The park that Margaret tried to destroy now made Willow Creek famous for the very thing she had always claimed to uphold, beauty and pride. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Margaret's house remained a dark void in the midst of brightness. She stopped attending meetings altogether. Her driveway grew cluttered with newspapers and packages no one picked up. Occasionally, the Range Rover would appear for a brief drive, but mostly it stayed hidden under a dusty cover. Some said she was embarrassed. Others said she was furious. The truth was probably both. Ethan didn't care anymore. He had moved past her. In the evenings, he sat on the stone bench under the maple tree, the soft hum of insects filling the air, the faint scent of flowers drifting on the breeze. The garden no longer represented revenge. It had become peace itself, proof that dignity, patience, and a quiet refusal to stoop could outlast any petty cruelty. One evening, the new HOA president stopped by. A kind woman named Elise, She asked if Ethan would allow the HOA to feature Cross Garden as part of the community's annual tour of homes. It would be the first public event held there, open to visitors and neighbors alike. Ethan agreed, but with one condition. The proceeds from the tour would go to neighborhood beautification, not the HOA's administrative budget. Fairleigh smiled and agreed without hesitation. The day of the event arrived under clear blue skies. Dozens of residents and guests strolled through the cul-de-sac, admiring the flowers, taking pictures, listening to Ethan's quiet explanations of the plants and layout. Children laughed. Music played softly from portable speakers. It felt alive, truly alive. Across the street, the blinds of Margaret's house quivered. A shadow appeared briefly at the window, then vanished. She didn't come out, but everyone knew she was there, forced to watch the celebration of the very thing she tried to erase. When evening came and the last of the guests departed, Ethan stood alone in the garden. The lanterns glowed softly, and for the first time since all of this began, he felt completely free. Margaret had taken his space once, tried to take his peace, even his pride, but in the end, she had given him something greater, purpose. Because Cross Garden was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced by arrogance, anyone who had ever chosen quiet resilience over loud revenge. And as the breeze rustled the maple leaves overhead, Ethan smiled to himself. This wasn't just rebirth. It was redemption, the final proof that no matter how hard someone tried to poison your world, you could always plant something stronger in its place. For months after the rebirth of Cross Garden, peace reigned in Willow Creek Estates. The once fractured neighborhood now thrived in quiet unity. The new HOA leadership, led by Elise, was fair, approachable, and transparent. Rules were enforced with reason, not ego. Complaints were handled without gossip or intimidation. And through it all, Cross Garden stood as the neighborhood's pride, a small monument to what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied into submission. But peace, as Ethan had learned, never lasts forever. By late autumn, whispers began to circulate again. Faint rumors that Margaret Hollingsworth was planning her comeback. The signs were small at first. Her driveway, once cluttered with dust and leaves, was suddenly clear. The Range Rover, freshly washed, began appearing on the street again. New flower pots appeared on her porch, bright and deliberate, as though she was trying to signal something. For most, it seemed harmless. Maybe she was moving on. Maybe she wanted to rebuild her image. But Ethan knew better. Margaret wasn't the type to move on. She was the type to rebrand. The first public appearance came during the HOA's winter charity drive. For months she had avoided all meetings, but that evening, as neighbors gathered to load boxes of canned goods and donations, the sound of heels clicking across the pavement silenced the crowd. There she was, impeccably dressed, her blonde hair styled to perfection, a forced smile stretched across her face. She carried a tray of homemade cookies and spoke in that overly sweet tone she used when she wanted to sound innocent. "Hello, everyone," she said smoothly, placing her tray on the table. "I just thought I'd contribute to our lovely community again." The room fell silent. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. Nobody said anything for a long moment, not out of hostility but disbelief. Then Elise, ever composed, smiled politely and thanked her for the cookies. The tension eased. Conversations resumed, and for a while, Margaret floated from group to group, pretending nothing had ever happened. But behind that sugary politeness, her eyes kept drifting toward Ethan. He felt it every time, the weight of her gaze, the unspoken challenge. She didn't speak to him that night, but she didn't have to. He could see it written in her posture, in the rigid way she smiled when people praised Cross Garden. She was plotting something again. A few days later, Ethan received a letter in his mailbox. Hand-delivered, no postage. The handwriting was elegant, the message short. "Congratulations on your little park. It truly is lovely. I've been inspired to create something of my own. MH." The next week, workers arrived at Margaret's house. Trucks, lumber, and potted plants filled her driveway. She had filed a new improvement request, this time for a community enhancement project. When Elise announced it at the HOA meeting, murmurs spread across the room. The project was to be called Hollingsworth Garden Walk, a decorative installation across the strip of land near the entrance of the neighborhood, technically common property. Margaret was back, And she was going big. At first it seemed harmless, even admirable. She talked about beautifying the neighborhood, planting flowers, installing benches, adding a small fountain. But Ethan knew the pattern. Her projects were never about the community. They were about control. And soon the cracks began to show. The contractors she hired worked odd hours, loud machinery at dawn, trucks blocking driveways, debris scattered along the curb. When residents complained, she brushed them off, saying, "Progress can be inconvenient." She micromanaged every detail, berating workers publicly, barking orders like a general. Her fountain was oversized, her benches gold-painted, her sign enormous. It didn't say Hollingsworth Garden Walk as proposed. It said the Hollingsworth Memorial Park. Ethan couldn't help but notice the irony. It wasn't community improvement. It was vanity in full bloom. Still, he stayed quiet. He watched. The project finished just before Christmas. And for a brief moment, Margaret basked in the illusion of triumph. She hosted a small grand opening, inviting local officials, even hiring a photographer. She wore a ribboned sash and posed dramatically beside her fountain, but the celebration didn't last long. By mid-January, heavy rains arrived, the kind that tested every inch of Willow Creek's landscaping. Margaret's fountain, poorly installed, overflowed. The drainage failed. Water flooded the lower walkway, washing away mulch and turning the area into a swamp. Within days, the gold-painted benches began to rust. Residents started complaining again, not to her, but directly to the HOA. The so-called Memorial Park had become an eyesore, attracting mosquitoes and muck. Elise called for an emergency board review. Margaret showed up, flustered but defensive, insisting it was just a minor maintenance issue. But when the HOA's contracted landscaper presented the report, listing improper construction, unapproved modifications, and safety hazards, the room turned against her. The board voted unanimously to dismantle the Hollingsworth Memorial Park until proper repairs could be made. The fountain would be drained, the benches removed. Her face flushed crimson. She tried to argue, but no one listened. Not anymore. That evening, as Ethan walked past her house, he saw her standing on her porch in the fading light, staring at Cross Garden across the street. The glow of its lanterns reflected faintly in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked lost. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply continued walking, the crunch of gravel the only sound between them. Over the next few days, workers arrived to dismantle her failed project. The sound of drilling and scraping filled the air once again, but this time there was no excitement, just resignation. The fountain came down piece by piece. The golden benches were hauled away. By the end of the week, all that remained was bare dirt and the faint imprint of where her monument once stood. It was poetic symmetry. Where she had tried to build her legacy, only emptiness remained. And yet even in defeat, Margaret refused to disappear completely. Late one night, as Ethan sat beneath the maple tree, he caught sight of her once more, standing in her window, lights off, watching silently across the street. There was no malice in her face now, just reflection. Maybe for the first time in her life, she finally saw the difference between pride and purpose. By early spring, the scars of Margaret's failed project had faded from the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. The ground was reseeded, new shrubs were planted, and Elise made sure the HOA handled the cleanup professionally. For the first time in years, the neighborhood functioned smoothly. No drama, no conflict, just quiet normalcy. But beneath that surface peace, something was shifting again. Ethan first noticed it in the HOA newsletter. It was subtle, a new tone, a change in phrasing. The March edition included an oddly detailed reminder about proper property documentation and compliance audits. Then came another notice about records, review for all improvement projects approved in the past 3 years. At first, it seemed like standard procedure. But when he read the fine print, a familiar chill crept down his spine. The notice bore a new committee name, the Standards Restoration Task Force. And at the bottom, in neat cursive, a signature he hadn't seen in months, Margaret Hollingsworth. That advisor, she was back, not in charge, but in the shadows, consulting, influencing. Her title was harmless on paper, but Ethan knew what it meant. She had found a new way to pull strings without being the face of the operation. The following weeks confirmed his suspicion. Homeowners began receiving letters requesting old permits, photo documentation, and copies of project approvals. Most shrugged it off, assuming it was paperwork housekeeping. But Ethan's gut told him otherwise. One afternoon he found a thick envelope in his mailbox addressed to him directly. Inside was a formal audit request for Cross Garden, citing irregularities in project authorization. The letter demanded copies of all documentation within 7 days. He read it twice, then again. The wording was clever. It didn't accuse, it insinuated. The same strategy Margaret had always used. Ethan gathered his paperwork carefully. Permits, design plans, HOA approval forms, including the original document bearing Margaret's own signature. He scanned and submitted everything electronically, copying Elise and the full HOA board on the email. He added no commentary, no emotion, just evidence. Days passed without response. Then, suddenly, the neighborhood buzzed again. Rumors spread that several homeowners were being fined for documentation inconsistencies. A few residents quietly accused the new task force of selective targeting. Someone leaked that Margaret was reviewing files personally. Her return, though unofficial, was gaining traction. Ethan stayed calm but alert. He knew her pattern. Quiet manipulation, slow erosion of trust. She was rebuilding her influence from behind the curtain. Then one evening, Elise stopped by his house. Her usually calm demeanor carried tension. She handed him a folder and sighed. Inside were printouts of internal HOA emails, redacted but revealing enough. Margaret had been digging through archives, trying to prove that the original approval of Cross Garden had been processed under procedural error. Her goal was clear: to have it reclassified as unauthorized, opening the door for removal. Elise shook her head. "She's trying to rewrite history," she said quietly. "But I won't let her." That night, Ethan sat at his desk flipping through the papers. Margaret's persistence was astonishing. It wasn't even about the parking spot anymore. It was about reclaiming control of the narrative. She wanted the record to say she had been right all along, and that's when Ethan decided to act. Not defensively this time, strategically. He started compiling his own file, a timeline of events, every letter, every notice, every incident from the beginning. He included photographs of the original garden, the vandalism, the police report, the community rebuild, and public records of HOA board votes. He organized it neatly like a case file, a full chronicle of the Cross Garden War. Then he added something new: testimonials. Dozens of neighbors agreed to sign short statements describing the events, the bullying, the transformation of the neighborhood, and how Margaret's leadership had once divided them. Each one told the same story. Cross Garden didn't break the HOA's standard, it saved them. Ethan packaged it all into a single document, the HOA Transparency Report. He didn't publish it immediately. He waited for the right moment. That moment came at the next HOA open meeting. The community center was crowded that evening, the largest turnout since Margaret's ousting. Word had spread about the audits, the fines, and the whispers of her influence returning. When Elise opened the floor for discussion, Ethan stood up quietly, folder in hand. He spoke calmly, evenly, his voice steady. He didn't accuse or insult. He simply presented facts: the pattern of manipulation, the misuse of authority, the intimidation through bureaucracy. Then he opened his folder and placed copies of the transparency report on the table for everyone to see. Neighbors leaned forward, reading through the pages. Murmurs grew louder. Someone pointed to the section about the vandalism incident. Another gasped at the timeline of targeted notices. And finally, someone asked the question everyone had been thinking: why is Margaret still involved at all? Elise turned to the board. Her voice was firm now. "That's a question we all need to answer." By the end of the meeting, a vote was called. The Standards Restoration Task Force was dissolved, effective immediately. All ongoing audits were frozen, and Margaret Hollingsworth's advisory role was terminated. The room erupted in quiet applause, not loud, not mocking, but grateful. Margaret sat at the back of the room, pale and trembling. She hadn't expected Ethan to come prepared. She hadn't expected the neighbors she once controlled to stand against her. Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. She stood, collected her purse, and left without looking back. Afterward, several people thanked Ethan for standing up again, for doing it with calm instead of anger. But as he walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, he felt something heavier than satisfaction, closure. This time it truly felt final, or so he thought. Late that night, as he passed by Cross Garden on his way inside, he noticed an envelope tucked under one of the lanterns. No address, no signature, just one piece of folded paper inside. He opened it slowly. You think you've won, but the truth always finds a way to resurface. Enjoy your peace while it lasts. No name, but he didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret wasn't finished. Spring rolled into summer, and with it came a calm that felt uncertain. Willow Creek Estates had changed, physically, emotionally, culturally. The neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now greeted each other openly across lawns. Children played near Cross Garden. Couples took evening walks, and for the first time in years, nobody feared the HOA's shadow, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, like the last flicker of a candle refusing to go out. The anonymous letter sat in his desk drawer, folded neatly beside the old HOA notices. He'd almost convinced himself it was empty posturing. One last jab from a bitter woman, almost. Then one Monday morning, the calm cracked. A crew from the city arrived without warning. Orange vests, survey tools, clipboards. They began marking the curb beside Cross Garden with white paint, measuring boundaries, snapping photos. When Ethan approached, one of them mentioned a property line review requested through municipal channels. A review of what? They didn't say much else, but the implication was clear. Someone had filed a complaint claiming that the garden, his garden, encroached onto public right-of-way property. It was Margaret's last move. By using city bureaucracy, she'd found a lever outside the HOA's reach. If the city deemed part of Cross Garden illegal, they could order it removed, permanently. Ethan exhaled slowly, fighting the familiar mix of frustration and disbelief. He knew Margaret was meticulous. She wouldn't have launched this unless she thought she'd found something real. He spent that evening combing through maps, property deeds, and the original survey documents. Every measurement, every line. The lot boundaries were crystal clear. Cross Garden sat entirely within his property. There was no encroachment, but he also knew that truth alone wouldn't be enough. The city moved by paperwork, not sentiment, so he began compiling another file, not just for defense this time, but for transparency once again. He gathered statements from the HOA, the landscaping company, even the original surveyor. He printed satellite photos and diagrams with annotations showing the fence lines, every inch documented. By the time the official inspection date arrived, Ethan was ready. The city official was polite but distant, clipboard in hand. He took photos, measured, compared coordinates, and asked a few routine questions. Ethan answered calmly, presenting his documents without over-explaining. He'd learned long ago that patience often spoke louder than outrage. Days later, a letter arrived in the mail, plain envelope, official seal. He opened it on the porch, heart steady. Findings. The area in question lies fully within private property boundaries. No encroachment identified. Case closed. Just like that, Margaret's last maneuver crumbled. Ethan folded the letter carefully, feeling a mix of relief and something deeper. Not triumph, but release. He looked across the street toward her house. Curtains drawn, blinds closed. For weeks now it had remained that way. Rumor was she'd put it on the market again. But that night, she appeared once more. Not as the imperious figure she'd once been, but as a shadow in her doorway, watching quietly as dusk fell over the neighborhood. Ethan stayed seated on his porch, saying nothing, doing nothing. The air between them was still, heavy with years of conflict and lessons learned the hard way. For a moment he almost pitied her. Margaret had built her entire identity around control, the rules, the titles, the image of perfection. And one by one those pillars had fallen. What remained was a woman standing alone, staring at what her arrogance had destroyed. 2 weeks later, her for sale sign went up. By autumn, she was gone. When the moving trucks rolled out of Willow Creek, nobody came to wave goodbye. The neighborhood didn't celebrate her departure. They simply exhaled, as though finally allowed to breathe again. In her absence, something beautiful happened. The HOA restructured permanently. New bylaws were drafted to limit overreach and guarantee community voting rights. The once feared board became a true collective, where decisions were debated, not dictated. And Cross Garden, it flourished. What began as an act of defiance became a symbol of renewal. The garden expanded slightly that year, not in size but in purpose. A small wooden plaque was installed at its edge, carved simply. Respect grows where ego once stood. Neighbors often stopped to read it on evening walks. It wasn't flashy or moralizing, just a quiet truth carved into wood, born from pain and persistence. One Saturday during the community's fall festival, a young couple approached Ethan as he tended the flower beds. They had just moved into Margaret's old house, cheerful, friendly people. The woman smiled and said, "We've heard about this place. It's kind of the heart of the neighborhood, isn't it?" Ethan chuckled softly. Something like that. They didn't know the history. Maybe one day they'd hear it as a neighborhood story, softened by time, retold like folklore. But for now they just saw a peaceful garden, children laughing, and a street that finally felt like home. As the sun dipped behind the maple tree, Ethan leaned back against the bench, watching the glow dance across the lanterns. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine and cut grass, the smell of normalcy, of calm earned through chaos. He thought back to everything, the shouting, the notices, the late-night arguments, the petty power struggles that once consumed this quiet street. It was strange. He realized how people like Margaret could wield fear like a weapon, and yet lose everything the moment others stopped giving her that power. Control, after all, only existed as long as people believed in it. And now, nobody did. That night, as he closed his window, he glanced one last time toward the empty house across the street. Its porch light was off, its lawn overgrown, but instead of bitterness he felt gratitude. Because without her none of this, the unity, the growth, the perspective, would have ever taken root. In the end, Margaret Hollingsworth had taught Willow Creek a lesson no rulebook could, that real community doesn't come from control, it comes from respect. And so the garden remained, season after season, long after her name faded from memory. Not a monument to revenge, but a reminder of what survives when pride finally crumbles and peace takes its place.